Hi, church. I hope you're all having a great week. Today, I want to talk about happiness. In the Declaration of Independence, our founding fathers enshrined happiness along with life and liberty as three of our inalienable rights. The authors of the Declaration were offering a slight variation from the 17th century philosopher John Locke. Locke suggested that the three inalienable rights were life, liberty, and estate, which essentially means property. In our culture today, those two are not as far apart as they may appear. For many people, happiness is based on property. That is, it's a function of the things that they have or things they don't have but want to have. Certainly not everyone is a pure materialist. For others, happiness and fulfillment are based on some combination of achievement or experiences, particularly when those experiences can be recorded and shared on social media to demonstrate the exceptionality of our lives. Now, I'm not saying happiness is a bad thing. When God created Adam and Eve, he placed them in the Garden of Eden. And Eden in Hebrew means pleasure. So it's there right from the beginning. It's a part of God's intention. When Jesus speaks of the full and abundant life in John 10:10, it's hard to imagine that it doesn't in some way include our happiness. The preacher in Ecclesiastes actually suggests that there is nothing better in life than to eat, drink, and enjoy oneself. I mention all of this because the passage that I want to look at today, the two verses we'll work through, the Apostle Paul speaks of joy, but suggests a different source for joy than perhaps our culture might be accustomed. If you viewed the devotional last week, we talked about the metaphor that Paul was using for the Christian life. He offered two, said it's a race to be run and a work to be done. In verses 17 and 18 of chapter 2, Paul uses another metaphor, this time taken from the sacrificial system of the ancient Israelites. In that passage, Paul says this, "But even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me." Sometimes, as Christians, we think of the Israelite sacrificial system as purely about the issue of sin and dealing with sin and atonement for sin. And that's partially true. There is a day of atonement, Yom Kippur, and there is the sin offering. But there was a lot more. It wasn't just about sin. It's how you worshiped. In Numbers chapter 15 tells us if you or I were to bring a lamb, a ram, or a bull as our offering, along with our grain or flour, we should also bring what is called a drink offering. We'd bring our drink offering. I found this fascinating. With many offerings brought to God, you would eat part of the sacrifice, or the priests would eat part of it, and part of it, usually the fat of the offering, would be God's. As for the drink offering, the entire thing was to be poured out, emptied on the altar, meaning that the drink offering was all God's. It was all for him. Now let's take that back to what we saw the Apostle Paul saying. Paul considered himself to be a drink offering. His life poured out was a drink offering. It was an act of worship, and it was all for God. Even should that mean he be martyred, which of course we know that he was. And Paul didn't consider this a truth to be mourned, but one to be celebrated. His ability to pour his life out was an occasion for much rejoicing, double rejoicing on Paul's behalf and the Philippians' behalf. I can't help but think that Paul's delight in being poured out was in some way tied to his assertion a few verses earlier that Christ emptied himself. In our culture, happiness goes hand in hand with self-fulfillment, self-actualization, and material attainment. And what Paul is demonstrating here and throughout Philippians is that true lasting joy, fulfillment comes not from our attempts at self-filling, but self-emptying in the name of God. Not according to our priorities and our purposes, but God's will, and through our service to Him and others. I guess the question, as you think about this metaphor and the way that you've ordered and are living your life, are you being poured out? If so, for who? For what? If for God, are you saving that some of that for yourself, or are you giving it all to God, pouring out all of it for God? How about this? Whose happiness are you living for? Living for yours or for God? I hope this is a gracious burr in your saddle as it has been in mine.